another audible in tonight's show, Karn. I want to go to our guest in studio. Well, not in studio, but she's here in the Zoom call. Alison Morrow is a excellent independent journalist. She used to do TV work for those big corporations, and then she found a better opportunity. And I figured we'd either talk about homeschool, homesteading, independent journalism, anything she wanted to talk about. Allison, welcome to Grand Theft World. How are you doing?
Thank you. Oh, I'm doing great. How are you all? It's an honor to be here.
Well, I wanted to make sure we accommodate your parental obligations. I have a 6-year-old, so I understand what bedtime means. And I wanted to make sure that you've already done other interviews and videos today. I think I saw your Alex Berenson video earlier today. So you've already had a full day of work. So I wanted to make this easy. I wanted to introduce your work to the audience and see how you were doing and what you were planning to do next. So welcome. Where would you like to begin? Do you want to start with your TV work? How'd you get into TV? Producing for Fox back in the day, right?
Right. That was my first job out of college. That should tell you a lot about who's putting together network and cable news. I was 22 and I didn't know anything about how the world works. I barely know anything now, but I definitely did not know anything back then. And I was the one that was putting together all the information packets for the anchors. I worked for the morning show Fox and Friends. And, I was thinking the other day about this one morning where I was allowed to come in that the next day. So normally when you work for a morning show, you're producing a day ahead, right? Because everybody comes in at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. So the work for the next day starts after the show of that day. So when you're a segment producer for one of these shows, you're booking guests, and then for whatever topic, the team decides that you're stacking the whole show basically a day before, and they're like, okay, we're going to give Allison the War on Terror. So I'm like a 22-year-old out of college. And okay, who am I going to book for the War on Terror? I don't know. It's this guy's in the Rolodex. I'll book that person. And then you got to put their bio in the packet for the anchors and book the car for them for 3:30 in the morning the next day. And then put all the information you can find from the internet into a packet. So the anchors have their talking points and their background, and then you even write questions for them. Now, some anchors are more independent than others, so they don't rely on the packets as much. But I was just saying, I remember one morning where I was scheduled to actually come in after the show because they would stack the schedule so that not everybody came in at 3 o'clock in the morning. So that day I was coming in the like 9 o'clock shift the day after, and I got reamed by my boss because I accidentally took the packets home and I kept them in my purse and I forgot to leave them. And it just goes to show they're like, well, they didn't know what they were talking about. There was one particular anchor who was very mad about it. And I'm thinking, like if they need my packet to get through the show, this is a serious problem because I don't even know what I'm doing. I'm just Googling the background and whatever Google says is there. I'm copying and pasting it into some paper and then putting it into these packets. So that was how that all came together. And honestly, the reason I left was not because I necessarily had a moral crisis. It was more so because I guess I kind of felt like I'm not really sure what my life is going towards here. I feel like I'm just kind of repeating the same thing. I didn't see any purpose to it. There was a lot of fun stuff. I got to meet some cool people when I was there, but I just didn't, I don't know. I just didn't feel like I was doing something that I really loved. So I left and went to graduate school. I actually went to seminary and then got a Master of Divinity degree, specialized in psychology and counseling. And then I won't get into all of it, but I ended up deciding in my last class, preaching, that I was going to go back into the news world, but as a reporter. And so I did 12 years in local TV news and then quit in 2019.
All right. So the first part is like Winona Ryder in Reality Bites. And then in the second part, she goes to seminary. I haven't seen the sequel to Reality Bites. So the realization that these older people, they're more adult than you, they're senior people, that they can't do their job without your packet. What was that like for you as an epiphany to be like, wow?
I mean, I guess I don't know if at the time I had sort of the existential words for how depressing that is because I didn't really comprehend the system at the time. So I guess now looking back on it, it seems egregious. back then I was thinking, well, come on, are you serious? Like, get your act together. I mean, you're paid like $1 million a year. You're twice my age. Like, you can't deal with one morning without your information packets. And so it was just more annoying, I guess, at the time, because I got so disciplined by. And so I just looked at it kind of like, whatever, dude, this is dumb. But I now looking back on it, now that I understand a lot more about how much influence they have, and how manipulative these special interests are, and they're all working together. And I was just like one little link in the chain, as Aretha Franklin says, right? I mean, I didn't realize though the system that I was participating in. And so I think at the time it wasn't necessarily like I said, I didn't leave because I was necessarily having this existential crisis. Like I was like, I can't believe I'm participating in this system. I was just kind of bored. I was a little bored. I wasn't really sure what the point of going to work was every day. And I just decided to leave. And so I didn't even really quite comprehend journalism at the time. Like, what was the point of journalism? And so when I went back to grad school, I thought I'd go be a psychologist. That was my plan. I was getting a master's degree to then go get a PhD in psychology and counseling. And I fully thought I was done with news. I was planning to be a counselor.
And then how did you get into investigative journalism?
Well, I was never officially like an investigative journalist. My last 5 years, I covered the environment, which I did do investigations for, but I mostly focused on, anything. I could go to the woods where they were releasing Wolverine one day, and another day investigate the state for corruption. When I was in seminary, I took a lot of classes, obviously, like I was saying, in psychology and counseling, and I tried very hard to avoid preaching class because I did not want to work in a church. I am a Christian, but I just didn't. I've never understood the politics within church administration. If you go to seminary, you will see why so many churches are dysfunctional, because you hear the backstories of like, no, we can't have that hymn on Sunday. How could we possibly? You gotta dip the bread. You can't drink the wine. I mean, it's nuts what people argue about when it comes to religion. Here I am thinking, I thought we were talking about the biggest thing ever, like God, not all these tiny little arguments that people debate about, which, who cares, if you sing that one song versus the other song. But apparently that's what a lot of people argue about behind the scenes in church administration. So I wanted to stay out of the classes where people were having to have those kinds of conversations because I didn't care. And they would not let me graduate unless I took preaching. So I took it my last semester of my last year, and I sat in the back of the room, and I was like, I'm just here so I don't get fined. I don't know if you know Marshawn Lynch. He used to play defense for the Seahawks. But he just would show up for press conferences and not say anything. And like, whenever they'd ask him a question, he'd go, I'm just here so I don't get fined. So that was why I went to preaching class, so that I could graduate. But actually, my professor, Dale Andrews, he gave this lecture the first day about how we're all storytellers. Every single one of us is regularly in the process of communicating reality to one another, like, and formulating meaning out of things that we've seen and done every day. And that if you're doing that for a community, you can either participate in doing it in a way that encourages thinking and purpose and intention and just something greater than, I guess, the sort of like typical daily grind. Or you can do it in a way that's divisive and chaotic and manipulative. And I don't know, for some reason, just like a light bulb went off in my head that I had never considered my old industry of news to be participating in that. And I didn't take journalism when I was in college. I was a history major and a French major. And so I never really studied journalism. And I guess that was the first time that I had ever had somebody kind of give me a larger reason for why you would care to be in this sort of storytelling professions, and why it would matter that you'd come to those professions with integrity and with a compass that is greater than a political group or affiliation, or just something, something like that would push you in the direction of just trying to have a team, I guess, and stir up popularity and ego, really, I guess, at the end of the day, to be guided by something greater than yourself versus your own ego. And so I decided to give it a shot. I got back into news. I wasn't sure I was going to stay there forever, but I did, four markets, basically. I started in Macon, Georgia. Then I went to Tampa, Florida. No, Macon, Knoxville, Tampa, Seattle. And Seattle was my last market.
So a couple years at each place, what was the pattern of how long you worked at each place before you moved along? And what new things came to you that you said, oh, I could put this to work to someplace else, or were they shifting you around?
That's a good question. Typically, I stayed for one contract until I got to Seattle. Normally, contracts are 2 to 3 years long. And when you work in TV news, local TV news, and then a lot of people have aspirations to do network reporting. You usually do that. You stay for maybe a contract, maybe 2 contracts, depending on what offers you have at the end of your contract. It's difficult because you get like 1 month to get a new job. And if there's nobody hiring, or the place you want to go isn't hiring, they won't let you work without a contract often. So then you end up re-signing, and then you got to wait another 2 or 3 years. So in my particular case, there were jobs that opened up that I thought were decent enough that I'm like, okay, when I was in Macon, I didn't have a contract. So I was only there 8 months, and I went to Knoxville, signed a 2-year deal there. And then I knew I wanted to move to a bigger market. So my hometown of the St. Pete, Tampa Bay area, Florida, opened up. So I decided to take that job. And then the Seattle job, I don't know, that was kind of a big leap for me because it was on the side of the country I'd really never been to before. I'd heard Seattle was kind of weird, but maybe also kind of fun, because I will say the benefit of working in the Seattle TV market is, unlike most television markets in the country, Seattleites, they don't really like crime news. They're not really interested in sort of what typically sells the bleeds it leads stuff that's at most newscasts. Seattle, that doesn't really work. So you have to think smarter in that market, weirder, I guess. People like, for instance, I pitched a story once about how I heard a postal worker was concerned that she was seeing so many dead bumblebees. And so she was stopping on her route to massage them and feed them Mountain Dew. And in no other market would a news director allow you to do that story, but they loved it at my TV station, and it did really well in Seattle. It just was a weird market, but you had to kind of think outside the box. It was one of those places where you could actually do smarter news. And that started to change, I think, with new management down the road. And now the market is sort of going into the more, fast paced, again, like I said, bleeds it leads stuff. But when I got there, it was one of the few markets left where if you had brains, you could use them there. Whereas in a lot of local TV markets, it's getting more and more difficult to do that, just because they just want fast paced, negative, flashy news.
And they want sanitized, safe, under contract, focused people to conduct their business. Because as you were discovering when you're making the packets, like that part of the content of the show is kind of an afterthought to those people. What they really need to do is say the right perspectives to please the advertiser so that they keep getting paid $1 million a year. Right. So there's a whole chain of bureaucracy that has nothing to do with telling a story, learning something from that story that's substantial and meaningful to life, and therefore people coming back to get more of that. Right. And I think that's what you do as an independent journalist now. And you had more freedom in Seattle than any of those other jobs. But there's also that limitation that comes with doing a job like that. When you're under contract, when you get out of contract to get a job, you have to wait for another contract to be up someplace else. It's kind of like musical chairs. You have to have you're done and you're standing up and the chair's open and you can go move to it. You might have to wait 6 months. And then a lot of people find themselves limited because of that structure. So I'm glad you got out. What were some of the triggering events that led to you being independent? and doing your own thing and applying your knowledge to learn anything for yourself and just do it.
Well, one thing that I think a lot of people misunderstand about the corporate news business is that, so at the highest level, I do believe that there's influence like what you're talking about, but at the local TV level, especially, but even at the network level, in my opinion, one of the biggest problems is that you have just so much homogeneity of thought. And perhaps that's not necessarily something you're hired for, but it's an energy maybe that, you give during the interview process, and then you do the work and don't cause any problems or any fuss. Not because somebody's like standing over you with a whip, but because you're in the system. You're not necessarily seeing outside of it. And you're kind of a true believer, or a stormtrooper, as I like to say. You don't need to be enslaved because you're happily enslaving yourself. I mean, you're ideologically unchallenged. And like, for example, when Trump won the election in 2016, and here I am, I'm the environmental reporter, so I didn't cover that kind of politics. I cover environment's very political, but I wasn't covering the presidential race or anything. Though I did cover the inaugural protest, and somebody got shot like a few feet from me. But anyway, that's a story for another day. But when I come into the newsroom and people are pitching stories like, I hear kindergartners are coming to school crying and it's the end of the world. It wasn't like our management said, hey guys, we need to do this story about how kids are crying in kindergarten over Trump's election because corporate wants it. Or like the Clintons or whoever,
Right.
whoever. It's the reporters really believe that. If you were seeing their personal Facebook pages like I was, they thought the world was going to end. And nobody was challenging them because a lot of people think exactly the same way. I mean, they start to become like each other, and there are very few people who push back, So then when you do, it can go one of a couple different directions. In some cases, if it's a story where maybe there's not a lot of concern over pushing back on the narrative, then maybe you get to do a story. But keep in mind, TV news goes very quickly, and you might have an hour or 2 hours a day to get your story together. So it's highly unlikely it's going to be well researched and well presented. And especially at 90 seconds or less, which is typically the limit, how are you going to present opposition that is nuanced and intelligent in that kind of world? So a lot of times the opposition doesn't get a chance to, doesn't get a fair shake simply because of how the system's set up. And if you're somebody who works within that, it's probably because, like I was, that you didn't really know what you were missing at the time. There was nobody there challenging it. You didn't have managers that were encouraging critical thinking, and you just weren't influenced by other ideas. Like you didn't have, your managers were like, hey, take a day and watch Grand Theft World, and get a different perspective. It just wasn't like that. And then, yes, there were topics like, to your question about, really where I was like, okay, there's something really wrong here, was, vaccines and climate change were two things that were just real no-nos. And I didn't know that until the very end, frankly, because I never brought them up. I wasn't, like I said, it wasn't that I was sitting around the whole time I was in TV news. Like, I know there are doctors who are critical of vaccines, or I know that there are scientists who are critical of the climate change narrative. I didn't know any of that, so I was never bringing it up. But when I did I did start hearing these ideas, and I would bring them up, just say, hey, this is out there, not like we have to cover it, or I even know if it's true. That was when I was basically told we don't let people question that stuff. And not because my boss said, we don't let people question that stuff because Pfizer is our main advertiser. It was because he was also a true believer. Like, he really believed that if you questioned these narratives, that you were nuts. You were an agent of serious, dangerous disinformation, and you needed to be silenced. And so I remember we got these shirts. I have it actually in my closet still, that said like truth seeker on them, because we were running this Stand for Truth campaign. And I remember getting this shirt, this truth seeker on it. And I told my dad, I'm like, it's truth seeker except for vaccines, climate change, and then we'll see what else. And I never got to find out what the other topics were because I eventually quit.
Well, once you started to see that, did you have doubts about, you might think, hey, I could do this on my own. I can bring news directly to an audience. And did you have doubts like, I don't know how to make a website, or what were the obstacles keeping you in the corporate job with like the golden handcuffs? Like if I just keep my mouth shut and go with the party line, I keep getting paid. That's a big jump. And a lot of people are stuck where you jumped from, right? So you have made the leap, you have made an impression, you have made a difference, you're making a bigger difference every day and you're getting better at it. But there's a lot of people who are in the situation where they're like, I don't know how to do these things. And that's going to keep them from making the decision. Whereas it sounded like you probably made a decision and figured it out along the way. And it's like a reversal of thinking.
Well, I was strategic about it in that I found a job as sort of a bridge that I could have my podcast and have a day job. I don't know if you know this story, but I took a job shooting videos about wildfire for the Washington Department of Natural Resources. So that was like my day job. And then on my off hours, I would do my podcast. My job was very much, it was very mundane. It was like, not maybe people wouldn't think going to wildfires is mundane, but it wasn't like very controversial. I'd go interview firefighters about what it's like being a wildland firefighter. Basically, that was what I did. And they knew I had my podcast when I started. And I knew that if I worked for the government, or at least I thought that if I worked for the government, I could talk about the stuff that I really wanted to get into on my podcast because I was working for the government and they weren't a corporation who could just silence me. So I thought it was a safe job, and it would be a job where I could also have a family and I wouldn't be, working 15 hours a day, traveling all over the place. So I thought, hey, it's not going to do this forever, but this is a good transition. Eventually I wanted to just do full time on my own media, but this would be a good transition. So they knew I had my podcast. They encouraged me to keep going with it. They thought it was cool that I had these followers. They were like, hey, promote us. I realized early on after taking an ethics class, though, that when you work for the government, it's illegal essentially to make money if you're associated with your job. So like, in other words, you can't take, somebody says, hey, we'll pay you $100 to be our MC for this event as Allison, the wildland firefighter videographer person. I would have to say no. So when I realized, okay, well, I might be monetized soon, because at the time I wasn't making any money. I didn't have enough people watching me, but I knew that eventually I would be. And I didn't want any collusion whatsoever. I didn't want anyone on my podcast to know I had this job shooting videos. I didn't want to mix the two. So I was very serious about keeping them separate. Well, COVID comes along. I switch my podcast to censorship because I was just doing, some media analysis and like our family's moving towards homesteading. We're renovating an Airstream to live in, all that stuff. It was, it wasn't very controversial, but as soon as COVID hit and I started seeing the influence that my old industry was having on public policy, on families, on people's health, I just couldn't stand by anymore and not talk about it. Eventually, they caught on to what I was doing. Mostly, there was one video in particular, which, God forbid, I had interviewed the former medical ethics director at UC Irvine, Dr. Aaron Cariotti. I got suspended from YouTube for it, because we talked about natural immunity. They saw my Twitter thread about how I should be reinstated and it's ridiculous. You can't talk about this. And they told me that if I wanted to keep my job, I had to stop interviewing people like that because they had a vaccine mandate and they didn't want anyone undermining, they said, their mandate. And I refused to comply. And so they fired me. So now that's how I ended up full time was I just refused to stop doing the censorship thing. And I refused to stop publicly associating. That's essentially what they said. Don't publicly associate with people who have any ideas that could get our firefighters and other people these, revolting. And I just couldn't believe it that they were asking me that. I'm like, you're the government. I have a First Amendment right to continue. I'm just not going to stop. No. So that was it. They terminated me. That's how I got to be who I am, I guess.
That's wonderful. That's probably the best firing you could have gotten in that situation because it really gives you mean, there's a lot of unknowns, but it also gives you your freedom, which is very exciting. Now you can interview anyone you
That's
want.
true.
You can ask them any questions you want. If YouTube wants to deplatform you, you got other platforms you can get the word out. And maybe it wasn't the highest and best use of your time. Maybe you were like undervaluing yourself as intellect in the world, and a critical eye and a critical ear to hear and to see these things and to hear these things and to be like, wait a minute, it conflicts with some other known data. Let's reconcile these contradictions, because that's valuable for the audience.
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't want to do that, we can do that all day. That's what alternative media does. We got to undo all these things that they say during the week in these 90-second segments.
Right.
You know, and you have to make hard choices, like which of the biggest stories are the ones that you can take time to help your audience get a deeper understanding of. And these other ones, well, maybe we don't need to understand them this week. We'll do it next week. But there's also like that responsibility to help the audience along, and your selection of what stories to cover. Do you have a radar? How long does it take you to produce a story? How much research do you put into it? And how do you prioritize or select them?
Well, most of what I do are live interviews. And the way I pick people is based on essentially anyone who's been maligned or in some way mischaracterized by my old industry or censored. I invite, and I tell my audience that I'm learning just like they are. So be critical, come with a critical hat, and be skeptical. I'm not endorsing. I'm listening. That's what journalism was back when I first started. At least I thought that's what we were there to do. We weren't there to silence the dissenter. We were there to explore their ideas and see if they had any validity to them. So that's what I do. I find people who have just been steamrolled by corporate news or censored by the big tech platforms, or in some way, have just unpopular ideas, I guess. And most people with like unpopular, and I don't mean unpopular in the sense that there probably are a lot of people who actually agree with them, but I mean the way the narrative goes, the sort of accepted way of thinking about things. Those are the people that I want to hear from. I think for a couple of reasons. Number one, because I personally was not privy to that when I lived in the bubble of corporate news. People were just, I guess you start getting used to the talking points, and until you start to get a certain level of knowledge about a particular topic, which most reporters, I don't think, the system is almost set up so that you only have a superficial level of knowledge about a topic anyway, because you're turning to a news story every day. And so it's like one day you're covering city council, the next day there's a murder down the street, and the next day it could be anything. And so if you're not paying attention, you think you're like, oh, I'm a mini expert today on all these things. You're like, no, you're not really. You don't really know what you're talking about. And when I started covering the environment, that was the first time that I had gained a level of competency to then finally see my blind spots and to realize all the people I hadn't interviewed for the story, or all the documents I hadn't read, and all the things that I didn't know. And yet here I was going on TV kind of presenting myself like an authority when I knew very well I was not an authority on the topic. And one time in particular, I remember covering the Clean Water Act, and I knew there were many holes in the dichotomy of this false dichotomy of Clean Water Act good, anyone who questions a Clean Water Act bad. I knew that was not true, that there were problems with the Clean Water Act. And I needed to read a Senate report to feel comfortable going on air. And I just did not have time. And I don't know if you all know this, but a lot of reporters shoot and edit their own video now. So you're driving the car, you're shooting the video, you're editing the video, you're writing it. I mean, there's just no time to like read documents. And I turned to the anchor who sat next to me. She'd been there 40 years, a long time, very well-known Seattle news anchor, and said, I can't read this report before air. I just don't have time. And I'm really frustrated about this. And she goes, just say what NBC said. They usually get it right. And that's how a lot of people think, just say what NBC said. We're an NBC affiliate. Just say what they said. They usually get it right. We'll just fly under the cover of their radar, which I realized, no, they don't. How is it possible that a New York City reporter who never covers the environment knows more than I do in Seattle as a full-time environmental reporter. I was one of the only full-time environmental reporters for a TV station in the entire country. There's no way that I wasn't one of the most knowledgeable environmental reporters in the country. And yet I still didn't know what I was talking about because I couldn't read the report. So that's just the way they thought. And, you have to finally get that level of competency before you can see your blind spots. And I think now that's what I'm trying to do, is just go into those blind spots, go into those dark corners that I had not explored before. I was an environmental reporter who never questioned the world's going to blow up from a heat ball in 10 years, so like I have a lot of questions. I didn't know there were scientists out there, legitimate scientists with legitimate questions about climate change. So now I want to hear from them. Why? Because I want to know what I've been missing out on for the last 15 years, and just hear their arguments and learn more about what I wasn't exposed to. And then also, I think it's kind of partially like an atonement, because I participated in a system that really created some damage among, not just communities, but like actual families, brothers not talking to sisters and moms not talking to their kids, because, well, you made this choice or you think that. Mm-hmm. And I just think it's horrible. So like, I think and maybe this goes back to my seminary training, but it's like, I want to model the behavior that I wasn't doing before. And I hope to see in other people, in that it's okay to have conversations with people who have different ideas, who think differently than you. You might learn something, or maybe you decide, no, I still kind of think what I thought before, but at least I'm better informed about it. Ideas are not an STD. Like, you can sit down and listen to somebody and hear what they have to say. And you can like talk to grandma who voted for somebody different, and stop believing this narrative that we're pushing on people, that kindergartners are crying, going to school, thinking the world's going to end. Oh my God, kindergartners are crying. I can't believe it. It probably has nothing to do with the fact that their parents are freaking out over everything that we've said over the last 2 years. And so to say, like, it's okay. Like, I'll talk to the dangerous people, so that other people who are like, oh, I can listen to that person, I can talk to that person, it's okay. Yeah, it's okay. Like, I'm sick and tired of this world where we feel like if we associate with someone publicly, we're going to explode into thin air. Like we're that's the narrative we've been fed over, I don't know, at least the last 4 to 6 years, that you can't even talk to people publicly anymore. And I just think that's such crap. So I do it just because, hey, if I can do it, and then maybe it's easier for you, to talk to somebody that you haven't talked to in a long time, because I showed you that it's okay to do it. Like, nothing happened to me, I'm still here, I'm alive. Then that to me would be a great way to live the rest of my life.
Yeah, it goes back to Aristotle said it. He said it's possible to consider an idea without becoming it or accepting it, to inspect it, right? So just because you inspect an idea or you interview somebody doesn't mean you advocate it. That's the process by which you come to a judgment or choice or conclusion, is through that information gathering and balancing and weighing the contradictions against each other and which one actually is substantial and which one needs to be dismissed type of methodology. And what you're doing is, NBC says, we just copy the Home Office. We don't need to know. We'll just say what they said. Nobody gets fired for saying what they said, right? Right. In the software industry, it's the same thing. You don't get fired for buying IBM. Like, you have to know what the thing is. If you just buy IBM, everyone's going to keep their jobs, right? It's a good bet. That's orthodoxy. What you do is heterodoxy. You're the one that says, wait, there might be some blind spots here, and the objects in fear might be larger than they appear. So let's dig in and get some real information and weigh it, because, to talk out against the Paris Climate Accords, oh, you're a crazy tinfoil hat person. But when you ask people to explain that for themselves, they can't do it. They're bought in emotionally, not rationally or reasonably, because they've weighed the facts, and you help bring new facts to the front of consideration for people. And that gives people choice. And I think that helps to ignite the flames of freedom. I think it's very necessary at this time that more people do likewise. So thank you.
Well, I mean, no, I don't. You have to thank me. I'm enjoying what I'm doing because I get to learn about stuff that is interesting. And I don't know, I guess I've always been somebody who likes the rebels. I mean, I think one of the reasons I wanted to be a counselor was because I wanted to hear people's stories of being an outsider, I guess, like just because I wanted to work with drug addicts. That was my goal. And I just always had a fascination with the outcasts. And I just, I don't know. And maybe like it's a theological reason, but at the end of the day, I find my identity in God alone. I don't, there's nothing that that being with somebody who has like a drug addiction or a disease or has a different idea or whatever, like that's not going to set my identity aflame. You can't hurt me. That's just the way I look at it. Like I'm okay. And so the people on the outside often are better at articulating their positions because they have to, they can't just rely on niceties that get passed around and everybody just accepts. And so they tend to be smarter and more interesting to listen to. And so they're just more fun to be around, but they also, a lot of cases are more authentic. And I think that's always been something that I've been attracted to, are people who may not say the popular thing, but they say the most authentic thing. And that's a very, I don't know. It's just a very attractive place to be, I guess, just being yourself. And so I would much rather be around somebody who says something very heterodox, but they believe it, they really believe it versus, it's just, and they're not necessarily like enraged by it or anything. It's just, they're just being honest versus somebody who has no idea, like they can't be honest about it because they don't really believe it. They don't even know what they're saying. They've just been fed it and they're just regurgitating it. I would much rather be around the other kind of person, just because they're interesting. And I think just more authentic.
Yeah. Interesting and genuine, makes people curious. Whereas like the clip that was going around of the press secretary doing the interview, explaining like, using the word salad gaslighting technique, it's like she's not qualified to answer the question in the first place. So it's not surprising that a press secretary who doesn't have that deep dive knowledge is going to give the runaround, but the journalist at the table shouldn't accept it. And all too often it's like supported like, oh yeah, you should just understand. And that's the official party line. Mm-hmm. But I think there's a lot more meaning and substance that come from people who take the time to read the documents, to take the time to find the people, to get them in front of a camera and a microphone and lights so that they can share their message with other people. I think it's a very important job, and the Fourth Estate has been lacking in it.
Well, it empowers the audience. I mean, not to cut in real quick, but it empowers the audience because it gives them the confidence to say, like, I can make a decision here. I can make a choice about how I respond to who this person, in this case, Allison, you would be interviewing. I think that's really important to re-inspire confidence in the individual, to be like, I don't have to go on these regurgitated talking points. Like in a weird way, the mainstream media sort of perpetuates a Dunning-Kruger effect, which gives a semblance to the average person that everything's sort of figured out. They have, the news is sort of everything in these nice, neat little boxes, and that sort of conditions how I view reality. Don't need to do any more research there, and everything's sort of nice and neat, and that, everything's good. But when you actually look at the neglected aspects, bring in the context by bringing in heterodox viewpoints, whether you agree with it or not, to your point too, as long as those people are authentic in what they're trying to present, even if they're wrong, I want to hear that. That's the important aspect of free speech. I want to hear their opinion. I want to hear where they might be wrong. Why are they believing in certain narratives so much? Like, what is giving them the impetus behind that? Because then you get to know perspectives, why people give into certain narratives and ideas so much more when you get to explore it in a dialogue. Well,
the gist is like free speech is reserved so that I have the right to say things that other people don't want to hear. That's the thing. And if you don't have that and people aren't reviewing the things they don't want to hear, you're not hearing the other parts of the free speech. You're in the echo chamber. And that's why I think it's important for people to like take the right side, the left side, and all other sides of information. If it's an important topic to you and you're really going to like make a decision or a judgment in your life that has like efficacy, you need to weigh it equally. Otherwise, you're not going to see results that you're seeking. And I think that independent journalists like yourself are helping to put like these topics out there for consideration. And more importantly, you're not preaching to the choir, to use that Seminary reference, you are giving the choir the ability, because your stories have handles, they got links, you can share them around, and it's not people to people, because there's a divide there. People are filling and crossing that divide with media from content producers like yourself. And I think that's the healing that needs to go on, because otherwise everything's being set up for civil war or a mass forest fire, to use another reference.
But it's divide and conquer through ideological persuasions. That's one of the most important things you said earlier, Allison, is that no one's held by gunpoint. These are people that are sort of ideologically possessed by certain narratives, whether it's economic, whether it's political, whether it's cultural, when it comes to the woke narratives that are going around. I think that's the key thing, is that the road paved what's that old cliche? The road paved to hell is with good intentions, right? And some of these people, they really believe in what they're doing. They really believe in the narrative. They believe they're on the right team. And that's sort of, when you do that, when you believe you're part of something that's greater than yourself or other people, which is important. That's a super important aspect of the human condition, but we prioritize it in the wrong areas. It becomes incredibly destructive, because then you other groups that aren't you. And once you do that, over time, that becomes more and more non-human. And it's a very scary sort of, slope to sort of trip over and fall down on. And so it's something to be aware of and be careful of. And I think, like, too often, I think in alternative media, we sort of present it, not us specifically, just alternative in general, as though, yes, there are some very dark, nefarious machinations going on around the world, but so much of it, and I just think about when I was listening to Peterson so much, Jordan Peterson, is ideological persuasion. It really is. Like, people are just so, like, we kill God. What happens? The blood is on our hands. And all of a sudden we deify political systems. We deify economic systems. And then they try to fill that void. And it sort of becomes messy. We call it the 20th century.
It seems like your seminary experience helped you find who you are. And you feel very strong in your identification of self. And once that's unshakable, then you can go and make change in the world. But they don't want people to have the foundation, like, for instance, you've built for yourself. What do you think made you so much more self-reliant than most people who do what you do?
Oh man, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure it's partially like just personality. I don't think I would ever call myself a rebel, in the sense that, I wasn't like really getting in a ton of like serious trouble when I was a kid, but I was always kind of a troublemaker. I mean, I never really was a conformist, I think. And so I think that's just a personality thing. I got kicked out of a lot of classes. I would think I was the only Math Honor Society president to get kicked out of the club for talking too much. I actually had like a very, I think, and I don't think this is a good thing, but I think I had sort of a disrespectful, like I was always sort of
obstinate a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I never thought you just got to be an authority. Like, I never understood why certain people, just like the principal, for instance, I guess, why are you the principal? Like, who made you principal? I mean, why should I listen to you? And now I think, like, I can understand, when I was in my old industry, I didn't go in there. I didn't go in there at the end, because I matured to see, like, okay, this is the authority in the newsroom. If I come in here and I just like throw my feet up on the desk and I scream at them every day, that's not going to win the game. So I can either be true to myself and push back on these narratives, or if they're not going to, allow me to be who I am, and ask these questions, and I'm just going to go, and I'm going to start my own thing. I'm not going to change. I may not change the management, and I'm not going to just, like when I was a kid, I get the way I was doing it. I just interrupt them while they were teaching, or, just wreak havoc in the classrooms. And then I got older and I realized, okay, it's their classroom. You know what I mean? It's my boss. They're the news director. But that doesn't mean that I need to be somebody besides myself in their newsroom. So if I can't be myself, then I'm just going to leave. And instead of getting just kicked out, I walked down and started my own thing. You can do that, I guess, as an adult. As a kid, I don't know what the right thing would have been for me to do, but I look back on it and I think it was just partially personality. I think my parents, did a good job of encouraging discovery. I spent a lot of time riding horses when I was a kid. And I think through that, I met all kinds of different people, like more of a country, lifestyle for a kid who actually grew up going to prep school and living in a city. I spent time at the barn with people from like all kinds of different backgrounds, folks who, you could see the street under their car because they had no floorboard, and they were mucking stalls. And then, people who were going to Harvard, and everybody in between. And I think my relationships too, being kind of outside of that bubble also made me realize that like, it was fun being friends with people who weren't necessarily in your social class or your intellectual class or whatever. I liked that variety. And so I don't know, like when you ask about that, it makes me think of, people ask me a lot, like, well, what would you do to reform journalism? And I think my focus, besides systemically, I think the way corporate news is done does not give you the time and the space to be a critical thinker. I don't think financing it differently is going to make a difference, because I never knew a single reporter who said, I know better, but I'm paid a ton of money, and so I have to say this. Like they're very, very much like on the narrative. They believe it. So that's not going to change it. I don't think giving somebody a ton more time without encouraging, and exposing them to different ideas, like it being a manager, I guess, who sets the example. Where I would go would be like, if you're talking about journalism students, for instance, I would start them early on, exposing them to like radical ideas, which are not really that radical, as I've come to find out. But, bringing in people who have like very different ideas, not just like the safe Republican talking point that's a little outside the box, the safe Democrat talking that's a little outside. I mean, like people who really push back on the system and the history they've been taught and the way things work and special interests and stuff. And then I think the most important thing is, after you expose them to those ideas, to have them sit down and evaluate themselves. What was their reaction to it? Did they feel angry? Were they scared? Like, who were their good guys and who are their bad guys? Why don't they like the idea that they just heard? Or why do they like the idea they just heard? Just so that there's some self-awareness built into the way they do their jobs. They're not thinking like, I'm just a drone who goes to work every day. And you don't just accept the press releases for what they are or accept your response to it. You start becoming more aware of, oh, I really want that team to win. Why? Why do I want that team to win? Like, why do I feel like that's the right way to go? Is it because it's really the truth? Or is it because that's my team? Or because my boss told me that we never question that narrative or whatever else? Because I think part of, the big problem, like just internally for a lot of people, no matter what industry you're in, is there's just so little self-awareness. And I don't think that that's taught enough when you go to journalism school, college, generally speaking, or definitely when you get into these newsrooms. It's just not a value that's really upheld.
Yeah, I'm a reader of journalism. So the way I see it, because I don't have your internal experience of these agencies, but it would seem for an investigative journalist to serve the audience, they themselves would need to know what their rights are, and then understand that government is there to secure our rights and protect them. And then the fourth estate is to make sure the government is securing and protecting our rights. And in that realm of fourth estate, you would need critical thinking, creative problem solving. You would need rhetoric to express to the audience some useful bit of information that is meant to help the audience secure and protect their rights, because that's what people really get back down to. And I don't think that's been a part of journalism like in the 20th century, unless you're looking at the classic muckrakers of the early 20th century. And it would never occur to Columbia Journalism School or any of these places to start with, here are your rights as an individual. Here's a lens of freedom and slavery. And now let's add some critical thinking and remove all these contradictions to bring the audience the 5 W's plus how in a coherent manner, such that they can now take, actions and make judgments based upon your journalism to better their lives. That's the convection current of causality that I think is broken, or purposely had some of the tracks removed where the trestles blown up.
Yeah, it's even worse nowadays. My old company, for instance, which is one of the largest TV ownership companies in the country, really the world, they force you to go through training, particularly like right now, I know they're doing race training that teaches you like, this is the way you have to see race. This is the way you have to see race relations. This is the way you have to see anything basically that in any way intersects with race. And they're bringing in, like, the teachers are very controversial figures who, you know, like if you're talking about Black people in, you know, specifically, a lot of, like, you know, folks that I watch, like in the independent world, would totally disagree with them, but they're brought in for the journalists to say, like, this is the way you have to think about what it's like to be Black. And this is what it's like. This is the right way to think about race. And so, yeah, they are now not only are they not being just taught critical thinking, but they're being taught, actually, this is the way you have to think through this particular topic. And the signal is not even just like, this is the way we want you to understand reality, but you could go to HR if you ask questions about this particular paradigm. So it's moving in the direction too of like closer to what you were describing at the beginning when we started talking, of more of an overt pressure. Whereas before, you know, I think a lot of people, like the majority, was just kind of a silent agreement. Everybody we all just, well, this is just an agreed upon truth in the newsroom. Now I think it's starting to become a little bit more egregious. So I would say that more than before, there are people who are like, I don't know if I jive with this, but they're telling me I basically have to think this way. And if I don't do stories like this, or if I question this, it's potentially a human resources violation. So I don't know how that ends, but that's definitely happening right now.
All right. I had a couple quick questions, and then we'll let you get on with your evening. I know you got lots of important things to do yet today. How old were you when you heard of Operation Mockingbird?
Probably like a year ago. I mean, I was not in TV news when I heard about that. I didn't, the CIA, you know, this was not part of my repertoire when I was in TV news at all. I wasn't talking about any of that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, to work in an industry that had been like deep captured long ago, they don't have to do a whole bunch of active stuff today, because they already got you saying, well, if this is what the headquarters said, if NBC Central says this, we can say it too. And that's just how it percolates down. And they discovered, I think the first quote when I did research on this back in the day, it was 1917, a Texas congressman named Oscar Callaway basically said all the shipping magnates and robber barons had deep captured the major media companies and established and put editors at each one. And they didn't have to control every media outlet in the country. It was just like 20 or 30 of them, but they established these, they put editors there. And
it's an influencer thing. It's an AP Reuters
creation.
Right. Everyone looks to AP and Reuters when they don't have their talking points. So it's the same idea. Once they had the leverage, that every news agency looks to them for the talking points. You have you have the narrative controlled across the entire nation. That's back in like 1917.
Yeah, no, I'm telling you that the vast majority of the stuff I've learned just in the last couple of years since being in the independent world, just listening to some of the people on Rockfin, for instance, I sit there and I'm like, what I mean, is this real?
That's actually a question I want to ask you. Like, when did you wake up to these larger, was it COVID sort of inspired the catalyst?
I still am. Yeah, I mean, I still am. I don't consider myself, you know, woke yet. I'm still waking up, and I'm continually shocked, but I try, you know, one thing I have to watch is I try not to then go the opposite end, which is like, you know, you're up at night, like staring at the ceiling and
down like rabbit holes with no end.
Yeah.
Like, I was just going to say, there's a point of buoyancy. So you do dive in and you sink a little bit, but then there's a buoyancy where you come back toward the surface, because you have to have a method of saying it has to be a meaningful, substantial, actual piece of evidence that I'm going to work from. Otherwise, I'm going to consider it conspiracy theory, right? Yeah. And like over the years, I've built I built a map. Let's see which button does that. So like for Operation Mockingbird, when I was trying to figure it out, I built a map and I started like asking the questions. What are the individual parts of this arena? And what are some of the places, you know, and CBS was part of it. So what was CBS and who ran it and who were the people, you know, and then what other secret weapons did they make from there, right? Our secret weapon. Anyway, in order to not get too lost and to like find your way back to reality all the time, because that's where we want to stay, right? We want to be reality based, but not denying bits of evidence and reality that don't fit the convenient narrative.
That's the importance of critical thinking, right? And what Allison said earlier, providing a dialectic. Like, we don't have to agree with these differing positions, these alternative positions. We just have to have a space where we get to hear it. I think that's the key thing. That's the most, because people are intelligent enough. They have the capacity for critical thinking. We all do. So when they are given the opportunity to engage it, I think they really do. Too often, I think people in power just assume that people are not rational or will not engage with that. Well, yeah. Well, if you legislate policies that make people act or don't give them the confidence or the ability to act in their own rational capacity, like lockdowns, for example, yeah, then they're going to become more emotional. They're going to react rather than think. And it's a key thing. So giving people the dialectic. When I teach logic, I talk about this all the time. I know it's uncomfortable, but find the best position you can against what you want to believe, and then challenge yourself. It is the most important thing I can teach, because it's going to do two things. On a psychological level, it actually challenges your identity, because we tie up our identity with our sort of beliefs and our understanding about the world. So it's a little bit of a boundary dissolving.
It's like a leash we put on ourselves.
Situation.
By considering the other side, you're able to have forward locomotion of learning.
Right.
Otherwise, people in their echo chambers just hop around on one leg, either right side or left side, and they're not really making progress.
Mm-hmm.
Being more divided.
Yeah. You can fall into the trap in the alternative world, I think, of just being a contrarian for contrarian's sake, and just being oppositional to the mainstream. For what, though? It just because that's what your audience wants to hear, or do you have reasons for that? So, yeah, I mean, because I'll get flack every once in a while if I interview somebody who has faced censorship or they've been mischaracterized by the news, but they're not like somebody said the other day, stop bringing people on that are still in the matrix or not fully out of the matrix. I'm like, what does that mean exactly? Like how far along do they have to be, or agree? How many things do they have to agree with you on for you to be willing to talk to them? Because isn't that exactly why I got out of mainstream news? And I don't want to be like that, because that's what they say. You can't talk to those people because they're wackadoodles. They're too crazy. And now this person's not crazy enough, so I can't bring them on.
You should ask your audience, what's the spectrum? From like chupacabras to reptile people, like where are we going to stop in here? Where do people have to be to start, and where do they have to stop before it's too far?
Right. Well, and it would be totally like disingenuous of me to like only talk to people who are at like some other level, because look at me. I mean, like I said, the most authentic, honest thing I can tell you guys about myself is that, I don't know everything. I can be wrong, and I'm still learning. I mean, these are, I come along on the journey. I just want people to know this is a journey for me, and through it, I'm learning just like I hope other people are. And frankly, I think a lot of people in my audience are way smarter than I am. So I don't want to be like a guru. I don't want to be an influencer. I call myself an outfluencer. I don't know what else to say it. I just don't want to be that person. I just want to listen to people. And hey, if you don't want to listen to this person, you don't have to, but I'm going to, because I want to hear what they have to say.
Where can people find your work, and where can they follow you most readily, and how can they contribute to your endeavors?
Well, one of the best places I think right now for me is I'm on Locals at AlisonMorrow.locals.com. That's with one L, Allison. And the reason I send people there is because I do an editorial board meeting on Saturdays, and it's just easier to, like, people can post there on my page. So I get a lot of story ideas from my audience over there. And then when you do my editorial board meetings, they're really small, but you pitch story ideas. Tell me what you thought about the last week's interviews. Who do you want to hear from this coming week? We talk about big picture stuff. Like this last weekend, we talked about who is the perfect censored person, because that comment I got from that person about the Matrix, like I really wanted to know, like, where would you draw the line? Would you say deception is where you would draw the line? I don't want to talk to anybody who's intentionally deceptive, but then how do you decide who's being intentionally deceptive? Like, how do you know who is and who, all that stuff. So we have those kinds of conversations, and I really look at it like an editorial board. Like, I don't want to be just on an island. I liked working with people. I liked the meetings back in the day when we could debate topics and feel comfortable doing so, bringing up different perspectives. And so I don't want to work solo. I really appreciate what the people who subscribe to my work bring to the table. And I do see them as like total equals, you know, and a lot of them are, like I said, are smarter than I am. So I'm there to learn too from them. I like that it's not top down. I think a lot of the stuff that I do now, I'm trying to reverse that, like top down. Thanks for watching the 5 o'clock news. I was posted out here in naming news today, you know, that model to like, we're having a conversation with each other. Like you, the viewers may know far more. And I think part of the reason that, you know, I enjoy that is that, like, a friend of mine who's still in the business, she said to me back when, I think it was probably beginning of 2021, and we knew like vaccines were going to be rolling out. I didn't know mandates were coming at the time, but I could feel the propaganda. I mean, it was like these COVID vaccines, there's something about like the way they're being pushed, and you can't question them and all this stuff. And so we were kind of texting back and forth about, she's like a true believer. And, you know, I was like, something's up here. I said, you know, just listen, pay attention to this. This is one of the biggest, I think, propaganda campaigns. Like COVID, generally speaking, is one of the thickest propaganda campaigns that we've been exposed to in our young journalism career. So just be aware. And she's like, well, we'll have to agree to disagree that it's propaganda or that there's any propaganda going on. She goes, but I understand why people are skeptical because they just don't know. And I think I tell that story so often because I think it really encapsulates how a lot of corporate journalists think about the audience. They just don't know. You know, we understand why you don't trust us because you just don't know. You know, we understand why you're skeptical of these things we're telling you because you just don't know. And if you would just listen to us, then you would know. And then, you know, and then we would all be in agreement and you'd like us again. And I wrote her back and I'm like, no, it's that they do know. That's the problem. Like they do know. They know better than we do. And I think if more journalists saw that the reason that the country, you know, in the United States anyway, has turned against them. The reason why there are so many people who are turning to alternative media sources is not because they're sheeple who have no idea and connection to reality and are just like being you know, propagandized by these disinformation agents on the internet. It's actually because they know that they're not getting the truth from the corporate news and they know better. You know, they actually know a lot more than the corporate journalists, and that's why they go somewhere else. So anyway, that's a long way of saying be on my editorial board, AlisonMorrow.locals.com. But I'm on every platform. I'm on Rockfin, I'm on YouTube, I'm on Rumble, I'm on Odyssey, I'm on Utreon, I'm everywhere. You know, YouTube's not, obviously, I don't think most of your audience is going to think YouTube's the best place to go. I cut my streams a lot on YouTube, but I stay there as a bridge, you know, because I was one of those people at one point that didn't know about the other platforms. I only knew about YouTube. And so I don't want to totally give up on, you know, it's the bridge to the other side, you know? And so I stay on it for that reason.
Well, you'll be on it. We'll put this interview on YouTube. We put a preview of the show also on YouTube, and we use a pirate channel for YouTube until they blank it every week. And then we create a new pirate channel.
Yeah.
But all those other outposts, Rockfin, Odyssey, Rumble, they're all fantastic. Yep. Locals. I also have Clint Russell. Clint Russell's on there. So I got to join Locals now. I got to check that out. Who started Locals? Dave. What's that guy?
It was a Dave Rubin thing, and I thought Jordan Peterson
Dave Rubin, really? Oh, interesting. I didn't realize.
I think Jordan Peterson had a role in it in some way. But now, you know, they're basically an arm of Rumble. Rumble bought them, so they're basically like one and the same.
Yeah, I checked out.
So far, I haven't had any issues. I haven't had. That would be issues. Totally honest.
Yeah. I haven't had any issues with Rumble, but I know they're based out of Columbus Circle, New York City, which is really expensive real estate, and that they're looking to like flip it at some point. Like it's a money operation. But they're getting money because they're giving people free uncensored speech. So right now we'll take it. We'll take it. I'm not going to criticize how they make capitalism work on their end. As long as we get to speak freely on their platform, we're good. Allison, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to help us better understand where you're coming from, where you're going, and how we can help you out. Say your Locals channel one more time.
AlisonMorrow.locals.com.
All right.
Thank you, guys.
We're going to go to one of your clips, I think, next. That way the audience can see some of your eloquence in action. It's been a couple weeks probably since we played one of your clips. So have a very good evening, and we'll go on with the show.
Okay. Thanks, guys. See ya.
Thank you.
Thank you, Allison.
What makes the Grand Theft World podcast unique, invigorating, exciting, and informative? Most other podcasts out there are either doing straight up interviews or they're just covering the daily news. They're covering current events from the day they happen. And that is effective. It's useful. It's a great starting point. And then sometimes these current events change during the week past the first story. So we like to give it a little time. You have to wait till some of the dust settles on these stories in order to give them accurate coverage. And the other thing that's really missing in the media landscape is covering the articles that are coming out every day. That's great. That's necessary. But who's bringing in contextual history so that you can understand what has been going on for decades and decades to lead up to the machinations and actions that we see unfolding today? So what we do here on the podcast is we cover current events. Many of these things are censored, but we wait about a week. As a forensic historian, I focused mainly through my career on the history of globalism and collectivism and things that they call maybe the New World Order. There's a lot of facts to these sort of circumstances, groups, events, activities, working groups that they've had over time. So for Grand Theft World listeners, we not only break down the current events, most of which that are censored during the week, we provide you with contextual history, we give you the source notes, the references, we do deep dives, and this really empowers you with an understanding of context and history so that you can make more informed decisions in your life. There's also a community, a membership where you guys can actually ask questions and we can get into the show and we can share evidence. And there's a town hall weekly for Grand Theft World for those who listen to it and are interested in covering the stories that we don't get to during a 6-hour show. Listening to it an hour a day, you could easily consume the week's news, but you're going to have substance and meaning and context and understanding. And with that, you can make higher quality decisions in your life. So if you're interested in more quality in your life, go to grandtheftworld.com, click podcast at the top, and we'll see you there. Thank you.
These allegations are false.
This isn't Grand Theft Auto, folks. This isn't a video game.
What are the most surprising things that you discovered once you started pulling on that thread? Who he was connected to, what institutions he was influential over, what events he participated in?
Come on, man. What are we talking about? Come on, man. No.
You don't have to think about it, dude.
I got this quote because you said you didn't know much about Klaus Schwab. I made it my job to, as soon as this happened, I'm like, okay, this guy's their front man. Let me learn about the official history of the World Economic Forum. I got their 40-year history. I got every book that Klaus Schwab has written or ghostwritten. I went through those books. This is one of the most interesting passages.
Come on, man. Come on.